I thought what I would talk about tonight is the regional question of the Middle East. The Middle East seems to always be at the center in recent years of the threats to peace that exist on a global level, whether that's the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is getting worse and worse, whether it's the US occupation and war in Iraq, which is getting worse and worse, whether it's the lies that we are being told about what US policy in the Middle East is all about. All of those things represent extraordinary threats to peace. I think that when we look at what the press is telling us right now, we're hearing that democracy is on the rise, right? Iraqis have had elections. Iraqis now maybe have a constitution. I haven't heard any news for the last 6 or 8 hours, so I don't know the latest, but the last I heard, both the Iraqi Election Commission itself and the United Nations electoral monitors were all saying it looks like fraud. That may or may not pan out. They said it's going to take some days to do the kinds of recounts necessary to see. But it's significant. What they found was that in 2 provinces, 95% of the voters voted yes. In 1 province, 95% of those voting voted no. And in 4 provinces, 95% of qualified voters voted. And all of those numbers don't match what the numbers usually are in internationally recognized traditional, typical voting patterns, especially for a country at war. So there's a great deal of concern about what this referendum was really all about. And I think that's something that we do have to take very seriously. But I also think it's important that we recognize what this process of constitution drafting and constitutional ratification and all of that represents, whether or not it turns out that the vote itself was fraudulent. It may turn out not to have been. It's certainly possible. I mean, right now, I think almost anything is possible in Iraq in terms of these kinds of issues of which communities would come out to vote, which ones would not. But I think there's some very serious problems about the Iraqi constitution that it's important for us to understand, because we're being sold a bill of goods. We're being told that this constitution is evidence that, 1, Iraq is a sovereign nation, 2, that it's moving towards democracy, 3, that this is an Iraqi initiative, 4, that it's been urgent and Iraqis are demanding that it happen fast, and that's why we had to have the vote right now. And what a surprise, not one of those things is actually very true. So we have some serious problems with this Constitution. Some of it has been talked about a lot. We've heard a lot about some of the very good language that indeed is present in this constitutional draft. Language that talks explicitly about defending a wide range of individual human rights. The right of free speech, the right to a trial, the right to being proved guilty beyond a reasonable doubt before you can be held in prison, the right to a lawyer. There's a whole host of those kinds of individual freedoms. It says that men and women are created equal and will have equal rights in the society, and that 25% of the seats in the future parliament will be reserved for women. These are all very good, kinds of things that we would all like to see in constitutions. We'd also like to see some of them implemented in our constitution, but that's a different matter. But what's, I think, not being talked about is a couple of things. One is, we're sort of being told, they don't quite say it like this, but they sure imply it, that for the first time Iraqis have a constitution. Isn't that fabulous? Well, sorry folks, but Iraq had, in fact, a very good constitution under a very bad regime, which ignored many of the tenets of that constitution, as so many regimes around the world do. We won't talk about where, but nonetheless, many regimes ignore their own constitutions. And Iraq was no different. The language of the old Iraqi constitution wasn't half bad. It really wasn't half bad. It had some of the most advanced language in the Middle East of any constitution around women's rights, for instance. So this is not something particularly new and different for Iraqis. But we're not hearing about it. We are hearing about some things. We're hearing a lot about the question of federalism. And that is indeed a very central question here, because what we're really talking about is not the idea of should there be provinces in Iraq, and should there be provincial governments? Nobody is questioning that there will be provinces and there should be provincial governments. The question is federalism a nation, a unified country that has some cantons or provinces or states or whatever they're called within it who have responsibility for certain things, whether it's roads or healthcare or whatever? Or are we talking about semi-independent, what we might call a real extremist version of federalism? And that's what's being proposed in the Iraqi constitution. And it will be institutionalized by the language that says that any power that is not explicitly granted to the central government devolves automatically to the regional or state or provincial government. So the main power is the province. And whatever they decide can be deliberately assigned to the central government is fine. The only two things they mention are foreign policy and defense of the borders. Everything else, including the economy, all individual rights, the nature of the courts, everything else lies in the hands of the provincial government. So what does that mean? It means, among other things, that all these great women's rights that we're hearing about can be overturned in a minute. So that if you have, for example, a woman in northern, well, let's use an example in southern Iraq, in the Shia-dominated areas, where they're talking about setting up a super, like a super region made up of 9 separate provinces, that in those Shia-dominated areas, they may create a Sharia court, meaning a religious court, an Islamic religious court. Now, according to the Constitution, women are created equal. Women have the same rights as men to, for example, initiate divorce, call for claiming child custody, any of those things. But if that woman happens to live in one of those 9 provinces in the south, she may not have the option, because the power will lie with the provincial government, not with the federal government, to overturn the Constitution, to write laws that directly contradict the Constitution, to create a court system that completely opposes a secular court system. So this is what we're actually facing with this draft that gives the reason of why so many people in Iraq have every reason to oppose it. It's not only people who are the supporters of the Ba'ath Party or who want to see Saddam Hussein not go on trial or something who are against this constitution. There's all kinds of reasons to be opposed to it. And that's the part that we are hearing about, the federalism issue. One of the parts we're not hearing at all is the whole question of control of the wealth of Iraq, the oil money. And this is one that could be really nightmarish in the future in terms of setting the stage for the real division of the country. Because what the Constitution says is that all Iraqi oil fields currently under production, the money from that belongs to the central government and is to be divided among the Iraqi people on a national, equal basis. It sounds exactly what it should be, right? Under the control of the central government, everybody gets a fair share of the wealth. That sounds right. The problem is, it's only that part of Iraq's known oil reserves currently under production. That's less than 1/3 of Iraq's known reserves. It's going to run out pretty quick. As soon as they start to expand to new oil fields that are not yet under production, that they know are there, they've done the exploration work, but they're not under production yet, that oil will not belong to the central government, and there will be no obligation on anybody to distribute it fairly across the whole country. That will be under the control of the region or province where the oil exists. That means in the north of Iraq, in the Kurdish zones, the northern oil fields are very rich oil fields. The Kurds are going to be very rich because they will control the oil. In the south, they're going to be even richer because Iraq's biggest and richest oil fields are in the southern provinces, in the Shia-dominated areas that will likely become this super region of 9 separate southern provinces. What that leaves is the band across the center of the country, where there's at least one province, Anbar province, dominated by Sunnis, but the rest of the country is a very mixed bag. The city of Baghdad is in that area, and this entire central area has no oil, and no obligation on the north or the south to share it. So what are the chances that they're going to share it? You know, I mean, let's be realistic here. So that's why people all across the country are so worried about this. Baghdad, not Basra, Baghdad is the largest Shia city in Iraq. 2 million Iraqi Shia, mostly poor, live in just one neighborhood in Baghdad, Sadr City. All Shia are going to be, wealthy and excited about this constitution. Well, sorry, but there's a bunch of Iraqi Shia in Baghdad who are going to get shafted by this, as much as the Sunni. So the opposition is coming from all over the place. All the more reason to doubt that there's anywhere where 95% are saying one thing or another. The other problem here is that the Constitution also says that other than the part of the oil fields that are already under production, when any new oil goes under production, it is to be produced and sold under the most modern terms of market tools, using the most modern market mechanisms. That means free trade, opening up the oil sector for purchase by the highest bidder. No protections, no guarantees that Iraqi oil companies, there's only 2 of them, will have the right to control those oil fields. They will be on the open market for purchase by Chevron or French Total or whatever, the international oil corporations. That ensures that Iraqis in the future, even in the oil-rich zones themselves, are not going to have control over their own resources. So the Constitution is pretty much a disaster. And ironically, while we're being told that it's going to set the stage for the withdrawal of US troops and peace and prosperity for Iraqis and democratization taking hold throughout the Middle East, what's actually happening is that whether or not it gets approved, whether it gets rejected or not, it's setting the stage for more violence. If it gets approved with a narrow margin and a huge sector of the population, including most of the Sunni population and many others, particularly secular Iraqis, being against it, it sets the stage for greater violence and antagonism because of that division. If it doesn't get approved because enough people say, this is not in our interests, we want a unified country, it sets the stage for future chaos because the entire political process now underway has to stop where it is and start all over again, electing a new parliament, which then has to start all over again, drafting a new constitution, and the possibility of anything changing gets delayed at least a year, maybe 2 years, and the US has made clear it has no intention of withdrawing. So the violence will continue because the US occupation will remain. So with all of this hoopla that we're hearing about democracy on the rise, what we really have on the rise in the Middle East is occupation, not democratization. Long before the US invaded Iraq, of course, there was already one occupation. There was the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territories in the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem. There were other occupations as well. There was the Moroccan occupation of Western Sahara. There was the Turkish occupation of Northern Cyprus. But the big one was the Israeli occupation. Now, there's another big one, and that is the US occupation of Iraq. And those 2 occupations shape the reality with which people across the region and increasingly around the world, with the only exception of here in the United States, this is what people understand is actually underway in the Middle East. It's not about democratization. It's not about freedom and prosperity. It's not about modernization. It's about occupation. And the reality is that I haven't been in too many occupied countries, but it seems to me that military occupation looks pretty much the same wherever it is. Some of the tools are different, some of the weapons may change, but the essence of it, the idea that a foreign military is occupying your country without your consent, breeds the same kind of anger and antagonism and resistance. Sometimes the resistance takes a military form, sometimes it takes a form of quiet, simmering rage. But I don't imagine that the German occupation of France and the French occupation of Algeria and the US occupation of Puerto Rico in the early days at least look all that different. I don't think that the US occupation today of Iraq and the Israeli occupation of Palestine that's been going on since 1967 look all that different. But there's another parallel that I think is important for us to keep in mind when we look at the region as a whole. And that is, what do these two occupations have to do with each other besides being military occupations that all look alike? One aspect is the role of the United States, which is central to both. Not because US troops are occupying Jenin or occupying Gaza City or occupying East Jerusalem, but because US economic and political and diplomatic and military support for Israel make the continuation of Israel's occupation possible. It's US support economically through the $3 to $4 billion a year in economic and military aid. It's the protection of Israel in the United Nations from being held accountable for its violations on the rare occasion when the US allows a resolution criticizing Israeli practices to go through. It makes sure that there is no implementation. And where the role of the United States as the backer, the uncritical backer of Israel as an expansionist nuclear power occupying another country, makes the continuation possible. So on one level, there's the role of the United States in general that gives the basis for talking about dual occupations and the relationship between them. Beyond that, there's the particular issue of this occupation of Iraq and this occupation in Palestine. And there, it gets a little more insidious, not least because we know very little about it if we had to depend on the press just in the United States. And here I'm talking about something quite specific involving the relationship between the US troops, the Pentagon, and the Israeli Defense Forces. Think back to the spring of 2002. It's a full year before the US invades Iraq. The issue of invading Iraq is only starting to bubble up to the surface of press accounts, and there's starting to be widespread unease about it. The war in Afghanistan is raging. Many people around the world are outraged that the US has transformed the global sympathy and support after 9/11 at the human level into a call for supporting a crusade, a violent war and crusade against Afghanistan. At that time, there was an escalation of violence in Israel and the Palestinian territories. The Israelis began to strengthen their military because the right to resist, including the right to resist militarily, does not include the right to attack civilians, even in self-defense. So some of that was illegal. All of the Israeli violence, of course, was illegal. And the Israelis responded by a further escalation, and in late March of that year, they stormed across the West Bank, reoccupying virtually every city and town in the West Bank. And in the city of Jenin, they attacked the refugee camp that attaches itself to the outside of the city. And in a 5-day catastrophic assault, they razed it to the ground and killed 58 Palestinians. And many around the world said that it was a massacre. UN officials went in saying that it was an abomination and an atrocity and that it looked like conventional warfare on the Israeli side. And there was a great deal of debate in the United States about, well, was it really a massacre? And Human Rights Watch issued a report saying that it wasn't a massacre because not all of the 58 Palestinians that were killed were unarmed, innocent civilians. Half of them were. Half of them were armed militants trying to defend their camp, their refugee camp, not succeeding, obviously. But there were 28 Palestinians who were killed who no one could argue were unarmed, innocent Palestinian. 9 of them were children under the age of 15. 11 of them were women. Most of the men were over the age of 50. And what Human Rights Watch also said, besides saying that this was not a massacre, they said that Israel had committed at least 10 separate violations of the laws of war crimes. At least 10 separate war crimes. It was in response to that the Pentagon sent emissaries to Israel to meet with the commanders of the IDF. And they said to them, we want you to teach our soldiers how to occupy an Arab country, because we know now that you know how to do it right. Now, we need to be clear, the United States doesn't need Israel to learn how to occupy another country. We're old hands at it. It doesn't need Israel to learn how to interrogate prisoners. We're old hands at that as well. But it realized, the Pentagon and some of the strategists in the Pentagon realized that the Israeli military had a long history with a very particular kind of experience that US troops didn't have very much of, which was in dealing with the particular cultural, national, religious particularities of Arab culture, Muslim religion, regional considerations. So why were we surprised that a few months later, when the pictures began to dribble out of Abu Ghraib, we began to see the kinds of interrogation techniques, the kind of, what are they called, pressure positions, they don't call it torture, that Israel has made famous across the West Bank and Gaza, because they were asked to teach American troops how to do it. Now, we didn't hear about that in this country. We did a little bit. The one general who was held responsible for the events of Abu Ghraib, the only one, Janice Karpinski, the only woman, perhaps not an accident, who should indeed be held accountable. I don't want to exonerate her. She should indeed be held accountable. But the fact is, she was the only general that was held accountable. All those above her on the food chain of the Pentagon were exonerated. But Janice Karpinski announced that there had been Israeli soldiers, Israeli trainers in Abu Ghraib, training interrogators. Now, I don't know whether that's true. It wasn't confirmed. She didn't come back to it and focus on it. She mentioned it once. It may be true, it may not. What we do know, because it was reported very widely in the world, only not in the United States, but in the BBC, The Observer, The Independent in the UK, in Le Monde in France, and other very mainstream publications. I'm not talking about the alternative independent media, but mainstream publications. We're very clear that this request for collaboration had gone forward. So when we talk about dual occupations, we're talking very specifically about conscious collaboration between occupiers. We might say that the US is acting as the enabler of the Israeli occupation, as simultaneously it carries out its own occupation in Iraq in the most direct way. So the question of perception becomes very important here. What we're being told is that what we're doing in the region is democratization. What everyone else in the region sees is growing occupation and blaming it on the United States. And this is important because many people in this country still believe themselves to be privileged enough that they should only have to worry about issues like foreign affairs and those kinds of, difficult things if it affects them personally. And here's where it does. Because we Americans, not just the American government, we ordinary people, increasingly around the world, and most particularly in the Middle East, are beginning to be held accountable not only for the actions of our government, for which it's quite obvious why, when governments do things in our name and brag about what a great democracy we are, implying that if we didn't like the policies, we could change it, and if we don't change it and we re-elect the same president, if indeed we re-elected him, that means we must want those policies in place. And that means, for people around the world, that we are accountable for those policies. And it means that we are also being held accountable for Israeli actions. Now, one can argue with that and say, we didn't tell the Israelis to go and bomb the refugee camps. We didn't tell them to go and kill 58 civilians, 58 Palestinians, of whom 28 were civilians, in Jenin. And that's true. But we didn't tell them not to. And that's as important. Because that is the sole strategic ally of an isolated rogue state that provides 25% of its entire foreign aid budget to a country that just happens to be the 17th wealthiest country in the world, there's a pretty good reason why we would be held responsible for what they do if we don't tell them not to do it. Not just in wrist-slapping admonishments, oh, we wish you wouldn't do that, but serious change in U.S. policy, making clear that U.S. support for Israel, whether it's economic or diplomatic or any other support, is thoroughly national law at the same time. But if we're talking about what people see in the region, Palestinians see it in their skies. Arabs throughout the region see it on their television screens. From Al Arabiya and Al Jazeera and every other station in the region, they see F-16s flown by Israeli pilots bombing refugee camps. They see Apache helicopters sending Hellfire missiles into shacks in Gaza. And they know where Israel got those F-16s and those Hellfire missiles and those Apache helicopters. And they see Caterpillar bulldozers demolishing Palestinian homes and wiping out Palestinian towns and refugee camps, demolishing olive trees that have stood for 300 or 400 or 500 years, and yes, on occasion, killing Rachel Corrie, a young American peace activist killed by an Israeli soldier driving a D9 Caterpillar bulldozer. The D9s are a very interesting phenomenon. I was just in Salem, and I noticed driving into Salem, there's a, not Salem, where was I before Salem? Eugene, I think, one of those towns. Eugene has a Caterpillar dealership right outside of town. I imagine Portland probably does too. It would be an interesting conversation to have with the franchise owners, because unlike, say, Lockheed Martin or Boeing or these companies that make weapons, they are weapons makers. That's their job. If you go to them and say, how can you do this? You're making bombs. They look at you like you're crazy and say, of course we're making bombs. That's our job. We're paid to make bombs. We're bomb makers. That's not the case for Caterpillar. They have a family-friendly image, and they want to keep it. They are associated with food and farming. It's the wheat farmers, the family farmers that made this country strong. That's the image of Caterpillar. Caterpillar now makes, besides their bulldozers, they make a whole line of clothes. I don't know if it's true here, but in a lot of colleges on the East Coast, Caterpillar boots have become very popular. They have the little cat logo, and they make sweatshirts and they make caps, and some of them are even union made. But they also make the D9 bulldozer, which is like a bulldozer combined with a tank, a bulldozer on steroids. It's 18 feet high. It's 24 feet long. And it's specially made to accept armored plates to make it a weapon. Now, the US company itself doesn't put that armor plating on, because if it did, it would be exporting a weapon. And it would be in violation not only of international law, but also of US law, something called the Arms Export Control Act, that regulates very strictly what a country can do with weapons provided by the United States. So they don't do that. They ship them ready to armor, but they are specially made for that purpose. These are not the same bulldozers that are used to plow the wheat. These are killer bulldozers. And that's why there's a national campaign underway in this country and in many countries around the world against Caterpillar, the CAT campaign. You can go to the website and look for the CAT campaign. There's a lot of good resources on it. And the significance of it is that a company like Caterpillar is vulnerable to concerns about their reputation. They're not known as a weapons manufacturer, and they don't want to be. In October, many of us were present in Chicago at the stockholders meeting of Caterpillar. And it was an astonishing thing. It went on all day. And a group of nuns who had bought some stock in Caterpillar to get into the meeting raised the question of how Caterpillar bulldozers were being used. And that became the sole question that the stockholders were demanding to have answers from the CEO and the board. Now, we didn't win that round, but we made some major steps. It's a very long process, but it's one that grows incrementally in every city that takes up a CAT campaign. And I say this because at this moment when we're building a movement globally around ending the war in Iraq, ending the drive towards US empire, if that indeed is what we're going to call it, there are links. There are links between the two occupations, and there are links in our movement. For many years, and many of you will remember this, the issue of Israel-Palestine was a divisive issue in our movement. It was a difficult issue. It was one nobody wanted to touch because, oh God, we're going to split the movement. things have changed. Not perfectly. It doesn't mean that everybody agrees on everything now and we're all going to join hands and sing Kumbaya and it's all going to be fine. It doesn't work that way in the real world. But it does mean that we have made incredible strides at broadening all of our collective understanding about how issues are linked. So that when we talk about ending the war in Iraq, we realize that we have to talk about what the regional context of the war in Iraq means. And when we talk about the regional context, it means that the Israel-Palestine conflict is at the centerpiece. And that's something that I think has been a long time coming, and we have a lot of work to do. We have to do it carefully. We can't simply pretend that even now, when we have made significant gains, that everyone who agrees that the war in Iraq is wrong and that the troops should be brought home, that everyone who believes that will also agree that the US should stop its support for the Israeli occupation. But because 62% of the American people now believe that we should bring home the troops, that means that almost 2/3 of the American people are in a position where they can begin to hear information that maybe they could never hear before. So it's a teaching moment like we have never had, and we absolutely cannot blow it. Since that day, in April of 2002, when Israel attacked Jenin, and people around the world saw it and heard the responses, and when it was happening in the context of the emergence of a global movement around Iraq, it has been clear that the issue of Israel-Palestine is going to be permanently part of the centerpiece of that broader movement. So now the question is, how do we do it right? How do we do it so that we bring people with us? That we don't say, this demonstration to bring home the troops is only for people who also agree to support the right of return of Palestinians and support an end to US occupation, US support for occupation, and support the CAT campaign. No. This is a moment to say, we are demonstrating, we are holding a teach-in, we are distributing literature about why and how and now to bring the troops home from Iraq. And while we're talking about that, we're going to talk about Palestine. We're going to talk about how these occupations fit together. We're going to talk about what is US strategy in the region as a whole. And we're going to bring more and more and more people with us each time we do. So it's transforming the political landscape. And the reason is we're talking about it in a new way. We're talking about it in a framework of human rights. This isn't about the kind of old language that we used to use that, you know, the Palestinians are the heroic victims who are standing up for their rights and the Israelis are the bad guys. It's not about that. It's about standing up for international law and human rights and demanding that our government do the same thing. And saying to our government, we don't want to live in a rogue state. We don't want to live under a government that is seen as a greater threat to any country around the world than any other government, which is the case right now in Europe. I mean, maybe some people like to live in a rogue state. I don't. I would rather live in a country that people liked around the world. It comes back, it's this issue also of self-interest. Remember I mentioned that there are still people in this country who believe that they only should have to deal with issues about foreign affairs when it affects them personally? Well, here's where it does. I travel in the Middle East all the time, and I have for a really long time. And the US has been doing bad stuff for a really long time. All the time since I've been traveling in the US, out of the US has still been doing really bad stuff all over the world. That's not new. I'm not that old. I mean, I'm plenty old, but I'm not old enough that you get my point. But what's different now, I never used to be afraid. I traveled all over the place, not just in the occupied territories in all around Palestine, but in Lebanon and in Syria and in Jordan and in Algeria and I was never afraid. These days, not so much. I mean, I'm not afraid, I still go, but it's a little more unnerving than it used to be. Why? Because people now are holding us accountable. Partly because this guy is president for a second term. Maybe the election was stolen, maybe not, but even if it was, he got an awful lot of popular votes. We can't pretend that's not the case. Our work has been great, but we haven't succeeded yet. And we have to realize that other people around the world are holding us accountable. So our job has a lot to do with us. We want to be able to travel around the world and not have people accusing us of supporting a government of war criminals. That's not a bad thing when we talk about self-interest. You know, I'd like to. It's, you know, this is a difficult moment on a global scale. We are standing on a precipice. We're standing on a knife's edge of greater war, expanding the war in Iraq to Iran or to Syria. I don't think those things are inevitable, but they certainly are possibilities. But at the same time, we have learned incredible lessons. If we look back and compare where we are now with Vietnam, look what we've been able to accomplish. We had a global movement against this war in Iraq before the war even began. That was extraordinary. How many of you were out demonstrating on February 15th of 2003? Most people in the room. That was the birth of what the New York Times began to call the second superpower. And it was an amazing thing. I think people probably heard that. It was one of those great terms that somebody crafted it. The New York Times did what they almost never do, told the truth on the front page above the fold. It was amazing. Once again, there are two superpowers in the world, they wrote, the United States and global public opinion. That was the day after February 15th. But what's really amazing about it, and what they missed, frankly, is that it wasn't just us in the street that made that second superpower. It was the combination of us in the street, us in the global sense, us all over the world. It started, you remember, in Australia and New Zealand and followed the sun across Asia and through Central Asia and into the mountains and then across Europe and down throughout all of Africa and across to Latin America and finally up to the US. We were the last as it followed the sun on that day. It wasn't only those people marching in the streets. It was also the fact that enough governments had been pressured by those people in the streets and by the fact that some powerful governments like France and Germany and Russia were, for their own narrow nationalist reasons, standing against the US war drive, that the United Nations itself was forced to do the right thing, what it's supposed to do according to its charter, to stand against the scourge of war. And you had those three together, the people in the streets, the governments, and the United Nations, and together that's what made the second superpower. That's what the New York Times didn't quite get. But somebody else did get that. I'll tell you one story from that morning, from February 15th. We had, just as people were starting to gather in New York, we had set up a meeting between Archbishop Desmond Tutu and the Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan. And the morning had begun with an interfaith service, and then we went with Bishop Tutu with a police escort across what they called the frozen zone. The whole area in front of the UN was empty. It was blocked off by police. No one was allowed to be there. It was also the frozen zone because it was the coldest day of the year. It got as high as 15 degrees that day. It was icy, bitter cold off the river, just freezing. And we went with this police escort with Bishop Tutu up to the 38th floor to meet with Kofi Annan. And Bishop Tutu began the meeting and he said, "We are here today on behalf of the people who are marching in 665 cities all around the world. And we're here to tell you that those people marching in those 665 cities, we claim the United Nations as our own, and we claim it in the name of the global mobilization for peace." It was an extraordinary moment. It was one of those moments when you say, whoa, this was just a little historical moment here, you know. And of course, it was the last thing Kofi Annan wanted to hear from his friends coming to put counter pressures on him while he was under such pressure from the United States. But nonetheless, it was something that resonated around the world on that singular day, that intersection of people and governments and the UN. We had, you remember, in the Security Council, what came to be called the uncommitted six, that refused to bow down to the US pressure to endorse the war. And these were not countries that ordinarily could go head-to-head with Washington. I'm not talking about Germany and France. I'm talking about Guinea, Cameroon, Angola, Pakistan, Chile, Mexico. These are poor countries, dependent on US support, with everything to lose. So, for example, Cameroon and Guinea both got aid under something called the US Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. Right? It's an aid and sort of free trade, quote, package. And they get a little bit of aid and some trade privileges. in return for opening up their markets to US goods. And the governments are very dependent on that. Hidden in that bill's language was this one line that said, that nobody had ever paid much attention to. It said, no one who gets aid, no country that gets aid under this bill may do anything that undermines US foreign policy interests. Didn't say what that might be, but you could be pretty sure that refusing to vote for the US war in the UN was probably going to qualify. Whatever else might qualify, that one was a pretty sure bet. And yet they stood defiant, and the sky did not fall in. They didn't lose their aid. Chile had been negotiating 7 years for a free trade agreement. It was a terrible agreement. We had all been mobilizing against it for years. But nonetheless, the Chilean government wanted it. And they were told they had finished the negotiations. All that was left was ratification by the Senate. And the Bush administration told them that we are not bringing it to the Senate for ratification until you sign on to our war. And the Chilean government stood defiant. And nothing happened. Eventually, they got their ratification. They had to fire their ambassador. He paid the price. But he got to become the ambassador to Argentina, so that wasn't so bad. You know, there was this sense that there could be resistance. Now, we know it didn't ultimately stop the war, but it did strip the United States of that desperately needed legitimation. It made clear that when the US went to war, it was in defiance of law, defiance of the UN Charter, defiant of world opinion, and it was illegal. And that made it possible to continue mobilizing at a broader level than we ever had before. The movements in the street. So the question is now, where are we now? Relative to Vietnam, we know that the war is now costing more than the war in Vietnam cost on a weekly basis. It's costing about $5.9 billion a month in Iraq. It was less than $5 billion in equatable dollars in Vietnam. There have already been more journalists killed in killed in Iraq than were killed in the entire time of the war in Vietnam. We know that during the Vietnam War there were 3 million Indochinese, Vietnamese, Laotians, and Cambodians who were killed in that war, and 55,000 Americans. We know that somewhere over 100,000 Iraqi civilians have already been killed. We know 1 year ago, that was the report. We're coming into the 1-year anniversary of the report in the British journal The Lancet, reporting on the team put together at Johns Hopkins University Public Health School that investigated how many civilian casualties and came up with a figure that was significantly more than 100,000 a year ago. Imagine what it is now, because our Pentagon, as you know, has said we don't do body counts. And we're coming very close. It will probably be a matter of 2 or 3 or 4 days when we will get to the 2,000th US military casualty in Iraq. We're getting very close to that moment. I think we'll hear later about some plans for how to commemorate that horrifying day. But the question then becomes, are we going to wait for a Walter Cronkite moment? Remember Walter Cronkite in 1968 after the Tet Offensive announcing the most trusted man in America, the anchor man for CBS News. He was the Jon Stewart of his day, who said for the first time, I mean, half the people in this country are getting their news from Jon Stewart. It's an astonishing thing. Luckily, he's a pretty smart guy, so that's not the worst thing in the world. But it took Walter Cronkite to say, this war is not winnable. We have to stop it. That transformed public opinion. How many more dead people do we want to have? Do we want to wait till we have 3 million killed in Iraq? Do we want to wait till we have 55,000 Americans killed? Are we going to wait for Jon Stewart to get up and say this war is not winnable? He's already pretty much said it. But this is, I think, what we face today. The situation has changed dramatically. We are not the minority fringe element out there pounding on the walls from outside. We are the ones who represent the vast majority of Americans. And we are not a silent majority. We are a loudmouth majority. And we've got to make our policymakers and our members of Congress and our mayors and our governors and our senators and the editorial boards of our newspapers recognize that when we have a demonstration or we publish a literature table or a book or a leaflet or whatever it is, when we hold a teach-in, that we are not the fringe elements that can be relegated to page 10 of the style section. We are representing America today. We are the majority. And we're seeing some of that in Congress. 6 months ago, you couldn't say the W word, I mean, you could say George W. all you wanted, but you couldn't say withdraw. It was political suicide. Now the debate is over, do we call for withdrawal now or withdrawal in 6 months or maybe in 1 year? Do we call for a timetable now or do we wait? It's how do we withdraw, it's not whether we withdraw. That's an absolutely amazing transformation. We now have an out of Iraq caucus in the US Congress. It's not a very good one yet, they don't really know what they're doing yet, but the saying that there should be no permanent bases in Iraq. So far, she only has 50 co-sponsors. That's pretty criminal. Where are the Democrats? Where's their spine? But it's beginning to change. The Freedom Fries guy, remember him during the run-up to the war? Walter Jones, the conservative Republican from North Carolina, was so angry at France for being against the war that he announced that never again would the cafeteria in the House of Representatives serve French fries, that from now on we'd only serve Freedom Fries. Well, the Freedom Fries guy has had a change of heart, and he now is co-sponsoring with Dennis Kucinich the Homeward Bound bill that calls on Bush to set a deadline, a timeline. It's not much of a bill, but it's a statement of change. It's a step forward. Why did he do it? Because he said that there were too many young men and women from his district coming home dead, and too many parents coming to him and asking why, and he had no answer. That's why he changed his mind. And it's because of us. It's because of organizations like Military Families Speak Out and Iraq Veterans Against the War and Gold Star Families for Peace. Those who in this country have paid the most immediate, direct price for the war in Iraq, the most similar to the price being paid by Iraqis. In Vietnam, it took almost 10 years before we had a Vietnam Veterans Against the War. We had it now in the first year of the war. We had Military Families Speak Out even before the war began, when soldiers were just being deployed, just their deployments were beginning. We're way ahead of that, but boy, do we have a lot of work to do. This is going to be a huge challenge, but we have to keep in mind our obligations to the rest of the world. On February 15th, Harry Belafonte said something quite extraordinary. He had been in this meeting with Bishop Tutu, with Kofi Annan, but later, out on the stage in front of this monumental crowd of 500,000 people on that freezing cold day, he said, the world has been waiting for us for a long time to see whether we existed, and they watched with trepidation, fearing we did not exist. And then I don't remember exactly the rest of the quote, but he went on to say, but we do exist, and we are the part of America that holds up the banners that our political leaders claim to represent, of freedom and democracy. We are the ones who represent that. That's going to be our job in this next period, to look at both occupations, to look at US policy in the region as a whole, to end the war, to bring the troops home, and then to talk about what else we owe the people of Iraq. Thank you.
You've been watching a special public affairs broadcast of the lecture, Dual Occupations, Iraq and Palestine in Bush's Empire. In a moment, we'll turn to some additional comments in response to a question from the audience. Our speaker has been Phyllis Bennis, Senior Analyst with the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C., and Fellow of the Transnational Institute in Amsterdam. Phyllis Bennis is a writer, political analyst, and activist on U.S. foreign policy and the United Nations. She is author of Calling the Shots, How Washington Dominates Today's UN, Before and After, U.S. Foreign Policy and the September 11th Crisis, and Understanding the Palestinian Conflict, a primer. Bennis helped found the U.S. campaign to end the Israeli occupation, and she works closely with the anti-war coalition United for Peace and Justice. For more information about the topic of this program, please visit our website at www.pdxjustice.org. And now we return to our speaker, Phyllis Bennis. One member of the audience asked how she responds to those who argue that if the U.S. were to withdraw from Iraq, the result would be chaos and a catastrophe for the Iraqi people.
Yeah, I think this is a very important question. I think that there is a principle that we should defend that says we did not send these soldiers there. It's not our obligation to do the logistical work of figuring out how to get them out. We are not logisticians. That's not our obligation. But the point is right. We do need answers to those very real questions that not only our opponents, but many of our friends and our potential friends believe, that it is to the disadvantage of Iraqis if we pull out precipitously. So we do need answers. I think our answer starts with the understanding that the US troops are the cause and not the solution to violence in Iraq. That's number one. Number two, the specific questions about there will be chaos, there will be civil war, it will make Iraq a center for global terrorism. All of those things exist now. What we have in Iraq today is what we never had before, which is a center for global terrorism, military chaos, and people losing their lives. We don't know, and we should not claim to know, exactly what will happen when the US troops are pulled out, whether it's pulling them out now as we are demanding or whether it's pulled out 5 years from now. We don't know for sure what will happen. We do know for sure what will happen if they stay. They will continue to die, and they will continue to kill. And that's what we know. The question of civil war, I think, is a very important one. I think that what we have in Iraq today is very close to the edge of civil war. It's not yet a sectarian-based civil war, where Sunnis are at war with Shia and Shia are at war with Kurds and Turkmens are at war with Christians. But it is nonetheless a growing civil war between those who support the occupation and those who oppose it. That's a civil war. So all the things that we are told might happen when we withdraw are happening today, and the only way to make it possible to stop them is by ending the occupation. Now, the next set of questions I think also has to be addressed, and that is, what's it going to look like when we pull out? And I think the answer is, it's not going to be pretty. It's not going to turn into Switzerland overnight. We have brought enormous devastation to the social fabric of Iraq through 12 years of sanctions and through this war. And it's going to take a lot to repair that. We owe the Iraqis a great deal. We owe many things. We owe reparations. We owe compensation for the years of destruction under sanctions. We owe real rebuilding and reconstruction, meaning money that goes to Iraqi companies and Iraqi workers and not to Halliburton and Bechtel. We owe all of that, but we don't owe military occupation. And if you want a slogan, I think the slogan is, end the war. Then we can talk about internationalizing the peace, because we will also have an obligation to help pay for, not to control, and probably not even to participate in, some kind of international peacekeeping that probably will be required after occupation. But that can only be legitimately discussed when the occupation is no longer there. We're not talking about replacing US troops with UN blue helmets. We're talking about ending occupation and then allowing Iraqis to assess what their needs are. And the question then emerges, well, who are going to be the legitimate Iraqis at that point? And the answer is, I don't know. I don't think it's necessarily going to be anyone I particularly would choose if I were choosing, but it's not my choice. I'm not an Iraqi. I don't get to choose. So I think we have to be very straightforward in saying people who are going to come to power who we probably won't like, men with guns are going to have too much power in that country for quite some time to come. But the one thing that I think is true is that it's going to dramatically change the nature of the resistance. Because while we don't know everything, maybe 1,200 fighters whose agenda is a kind of extremist Islamist agenda. Many of them are not Iraqis at all, are these foreign, I consider them terrorists because they're the ones that are prepared to attack civilians. But they are operating in a very privileged, protected environment at the center of a much wider and broader resistance movement whose focus is on ending the US occupation. When the occupation ends, that wide-ranging resistance movement that, according to US experts, is anywhere from 20 to 40,000 active fighters and up to 200,000 active supporters, that will disappear because their target is to end the occupation. They are nationalists, Baathists, communists, whatever. They're all kinds of people, Islamists of other sorts. But their goal is to end the occupation. And when that occupation is gone, they will stop fighting, leaving this hardcore to continue to fight, but much more isolated, easily identified, and easier to isolate and eliminate as a fighting force by arrest, etc., by the Iraqis themselves. So the end of violence is not going to happen immediately, but it can't happen as long as the US occupation continues. So that's, I think, our explanation.
You've been watching a special public affairs broadcast of the lecture, Dual Occupations, Iraq and Palestine in Bush's Empire. Our speaker has been Phyllis Bennis, Senior Analyst with the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C., and Fellow of the Transnational Institute in Amsterdam. For more information about the topic of this program, please visit our website at www.pdxjustice.org. This program has been produced by PDX Justice Media Productions. Thanks for tuning in, and thanks for supporting public access cable television, net neutrality, and all forms of grassroots, democratic, community media.